The album I want to talk about today is Random Access Memories by Daft Punk. And this album is so far removed from the sort of music that I usually listen to and certainly record that you couldn't really get any further, I think. And approaching a project like this, and I'm doing it because when we did the great recordings and I invited everyone to submit their suggestions, I saw this Daft Punk come up, and they'd recently been in the news because they'd split or whatever. And I thought, who is this? And I started listening to this album, as I have listened to basically all of the suggestions. And I found it so amazing. And the first thing that stuck out to me was obviously the look of this album. The cover is beautiful. It's really, it's just a beautifully made product if you look at the album and the CD and everything. But also the title, Random Access Memories. Now, do forgive me if you grew up with this album and this was the album where you became an adult too, and you will obviously know a hell of a lot more about Daft Punk and the two people in it, Thomas Bangalter and Guy-Manuel de Homem-Christo. You will know more about them than I certainly do. But having said that, it's just an incredible album because it is, when I was listening to it, it did bring back random memories from my past. So how did I go about the project? Because when I'm confronting myself with new music for me, what I do is I tend to play it in the background. So I get on with my work and I'm doing my office work, doing my emails, whatever, and I got it playing in the background. And then I'll make myself a coffee and go and sit down and I'll listen for a couple of minutes whilst I'm drinking my coffee, and then maybe at lunchtime eating an apple, just sitting down listening to bits. But really it's in the background, and I play it over and over again, maybe 4 or 5 times from one end to the other, until it's kind of in my system. And then it doesn't seem strange anymore. But you listen to it on a very sort of, we say in Flemish, oppervlakkig, sort of high level sort of way. You're not really listening to it in detail. So then once I've done that 4 or 5 times, I sit down in the listening room and I put it on, and then I just blast it out and go with it. Phone off, everything off, focus. And when I did that, it just blew me away because the recording quality is amazing. But the musicianship, let's just look at it. I mean, Thomas and Guy-Manuel are both in their late 30s. I think Thomas is 38 and Guy-Manuel's 39, or the other way around, I'm not sure. But they're 38 and 39 when they record this album, which actually, when you look at it, is quite late. And they're not very prolific. I was looking back at their discography. They weren't doing really albums more than every 4 years. There was the movie Tron, of course, went in between, but they weren't very prolific. I mean, if you compare it, I know the times had changed, but with the Beatles, when they recorded their last epic album, Abbey Road, John Lennon was 29. That's a whole 10 years younger than Thomas and Guy-Manuel. And there's a lot of difference in 10 years at that age in your life, I think. But, and this is the big but for me, the musicians they chose to bring into the room and make this amazing album were Nile Rodgers, Nathan East, and JR, the drummer, John Robinson. I mean, these guys, I mean, Nile, when he recorded that album, was 60 years old. That's just a few years younger than me now. And Nathan East, I think, was even older. I might be wrong, but Nathan East has been around the block. I mean, he's made more than 2,000 recordings. He's recorded with Michael Jackson. He's recorded with everyone, basically. And certainly with all the jazz greats. And J.R. Robinson, the same. So they've got Nile Rodgers, J.R. and Nathan East as the main rhythm section. Now the album, I get a feeling, is kind of like in 2 halves. It's sort of after the Get Lucky, I think it's the track Beyond, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, from Beyond onwards. That's where their other 2 musicians sort of kick in. And this is where we bring in James Genus on bass and then Omar Hakim on drums. And I know there's an amazing moment on the Giorgio by Moroda track where actually both drummers are working. JR and Omar are working on the same track, and you can tell exactly where one takes over. So how can I describe this album? Because I can't play it, obviously, for copyright reasons. So let me just go through a couple of the tracks and let's talk it through and why I think it deserves to be a great recording. Well, firstly, on the criteria, we don't have a problem, do we? Because it's recorded in the Electric Lady Studios in New York and in the famous Columbia Studios where all the greats have recorded, and obviously in Hanson's studio. So there's no question there. The recording quality is amazing. Thomas and Guy-Manuel did the producing themselves, but it was mixed down by Mick Guzowski, a 7 times Grammy Awards winner. And he's famous for working with everyone from Eric Clapton to Stanley Clarke, Patti LaBelle, Alicia Keys, and even Jamiroquai later on in his career. He's done a really masterful piece of work here, and he did the whole album apparently. Let's go back to the opening track, Give Life Back to Music. And you can't say that that album doesn't explode in its opening. I mean, it's just like the opening of the Bach Brandenburg No. 5 from Jacques Lussier, which I was with my last one, where that drums, and it goes boom, 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 and there's this drumming, and you think, okay, something big's going to happen. Exactly the same is happening here. This opening, incredible crescendo opening, and then very quickly going into that solid 4. It's impressive. And there's another thing I noticed in here. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, there it is. We'll flick it up onto the screen. There's a photograph of the synthesizer that Daft Punk use. And obviously it's upside down for whatever reason in my copy. I don't know if they printed it around the wrong way. I don't know. But it was upside down. But when you turn it around the right way, it's actually very, very similar to the Bach double keyboard that I was talking about in the Jacques Lussier great recordings. Excuse me. So that's just coincidence that I picked 2 albums out at random, and yet there's a direct link in the essence and the construction of the music. And so you're getting into this solid 4, and then you've got Nile Rodgers' sort of backing guitar, which takes you straight back to sort of chic in the 1970s and remembering those days growing up in South and East London. And then it goes into this wonderful track, Game of Love. Now, having listened to a number of Daft Punk's songs and albums now on Spotify, you do realize that lyrics are not the most important, they're not the most profound, but there's actually a beauty in the simplicity with them, and there's a theme that runs all the way through this album of kind of loss, and it's a loss where they have no control of. It was taken away from them, and this mood keeps coming back. And in Game of Love, it's so beautiful, and there's this incredible moment where he says, I just wanted you to stay. And it's so profound and so sad, and you can feel the sadness on both sides. And it's really a wonderful track. But it takes us into Giorgio by Moroda. And I think for me, if there's a highlight, it's probably A Moment in Touch. And then it's this track. Because in this track, you've got absolutely everything. Now, obviously, those of you will know, it'll open with the sort of sound of like he's in a coffee bar or something somewhere, and he's talking about his life and how he got started. And I don't normally like talking on an album, because after a couple of plays it gets irritating and you've heard it over and over again. You say, come on, yeah, let's just move on. But in this case, the sound of his voice, and they even credit the person who recorded him, the sound of his voice, the timbre of the voice, the content and the pace of the voice is kind of rhythmic, and it's going nicely with what's building up with the backing sound and the music coming in, that I found it absolutely mesmerizing, and I've played it over and over and over again. And there are albums where talking really works. Dark Side of the Moon, Pink Floyd, for example, a really good example for me. I never get tired of hearing the little bits of talking and trying to catch out what they're actually saying. So And then in this piece, everything happens. You know, you go from a solid 4 rhythm, bunk, 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 and the next, you know, they're going into a complete jazz swing, you know. And JR and Nathan East, they've just got the rhythm in this is so precise. The bass playing is mesmerizing. It's just so beautiful. It's so controlled. And again, it's not what he's playing, it's what he's not playing. It's the making everything look so easy. And I think that's probably true of the whole album. Everything just looks so easy. You're not going to think, oh, wow, 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 that's amazing musicianship. No, they're so slick. It looks easy. And yet, in the album, and the next thing you know, in that track, Giorgio by Moroda, you've got a full orchestra coming in. It's incredible. And it just gently blends in. And there is everything in it. And then suddenly, I'm listening to it and I'm thinking, you know what? The drums are out of control. It's getting louder and more frantic and frantic. And then I realise, of course, that Omar Hakim is coming onto track. When you read the track information closely, you see that he's also playing on this track. And there's this moment where it's like Sledgehammer from Peter Gabriel, where if you listen to the end of that track, it's just like the guy is hitting every single drum and cymbal he can find in any sequence he can think of, and it's like totally out of control. It's your Muppets Animals, but 10 times. And this is all happening in the Giorgio by Moroda track. And you know it's completely controlled, but it sounds fabulous, fabulous. And actually, I have to say, I did listen to it once on headphones all the way through, but I much preferred it on 2-channel, to be honest. I think on the headphones there was too much movement going around and it distracts you. But on 2-channel, you know, played at a reasonable volume, it was great. Now, let's just get to the end of Giorgio by Moroda, because at the end, all the instruments start to disappear. You know, it's a bit like the Haydn Symphony, where all the musicians are leaving the farewell until you just got one left. And what are we left with? We're left with this synthesizer. And the synthesizer is slowing down and it's going lower. And then it goes down until it's just going bop, 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 bop. And the sound of it is great. And it reminded me of Dire Straits' album on there was that track where the bass and the drum was going tuk, 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 and that sound, the first time you hear it, you think, oh, I've never heard anything. And earlier in the track, Giorgio Moroder had actually talked about adding a click track. And there's just like this click and thump at the same time. And when you listen to that loud on a 2-channel system like this, or I'm sure on your systems too, it just sounds amazing, especially if you've got the deep, deep bass coming out. It's just wonderful. So you're getting the fun of the sounds, the great musicianship, orchestra, swing, 4/4, solid 4, great rhythm guitar from Nile Rodgers. You've got everything in one track, and the story of how Giorgio Moroder started. So wonderful. Then you think, well, as that synthesizer dies down, you think, what on earth could you follow that with? And that is where the sheer genius of Daft Punk, and I'm using that word reservedly, carefully, I think we have to call it that in this context. The sheer genius in this context is what you follow it with. And what they follow it with is the most amazing piano from a Chili Gonzalez. And I didn't know who he was, so I looked him up, Wikipedia, Chili Gonzalez, and he's a classically trained Canadian pianist, composer. And I knew he had to be, because if you listen to the chord progression, they're kind of obvious, but not obvious at the same time. It's like listening to certain Mozart when you think, oh, I know what's coming next. And it doesn't. It doesn't. It's slightly different, but it sounds so natural, so simple. It's a sublime moment in the whole album. Just that little piece on an acoustic piano. And yet, there's a moment when the track builds and actually it morphs into an electric piano or some kind of synthesizer. I think it's an electric piano. And you don't realize where one stops and the other begins. It just is a masterpiece of engineering, how that morphs into each other. And everybody says, yeah, oh yeah, it's easy, you fade one out and fade it. It isn't that easy. Trust me, I've been there. This is really masterful work. It's beautiful. And so obviously the album progresses. And I said earlier, it's kind of like an album of two halves, because when you've got James Genus coming in, and he's played with Bill Evans, again linked with Miles Davis, the great jazz people, again these are jazz people, and Hakim coming in the second half from Beyond, there's a more, not aggressive, it's more attacking, more vibrant, more, the sound of dynamism. It's a little bit angry in some ways in the backing, and yet it's still very controlled and very beautiful. And again, we get some more talking coming back in, don't we, towards the end on the track where the NASA guy is talking from Apollo 17 and Contact, and you get this element back. And I'm looking back on the album called Random Access Memories. And what do I remember? Well, when I'm listening to Giorgio by Moroda, there's a point when there's a sort of an electric violin type sound and synthesizers and dynamic drumming. And I'm just totally reminded of a track by Curved Air, Backstreet Love, from 1971. And if you think how old Thomas and Guy-Manuel are, it is possible that their parents, or they were brought up with Curved Air in their life. There's elements of this album which remind me of like moody blues. I mean, there's sort of not just the talking, but the orchestral arrangements, the profound searching, looking up to the stars. It's much better than the moody blues. It's much more mature. These people are 38, 39. They kind of know what they're doing. The recording quality, of course, is fantastic, whereas the poor Moody Blues had to do everything on tape and master it on top. They didn't have real orchestras because probably the budget wasn't there. They had to use mellotrons and that kind of thing, which were sounding pretty awful. But there's elements of everything in this album, which makes it so special. And the elements come together and they work together. It's not embarrassing like Days of Future Past album, sorry, but for me that's an embarrassing album. The orchestra and the Moody Blues together, it doesn't work. You know, only bits of Nights and White Satin, but even then, the orchestra's faded out by the time that track starts, and you think, yes, okay. So, what can I do to wrap up here? It's just fabulous. And take the last track, for example, you've got to build it to something, haven't you? Like Sgt. Pepper builds and builds and builds and builds and builds at the end. Well, Contact does exactly the same. The pitch is rising and rising. But if you listen closely, it's just like the steps of Escher. You know, it appears to be rising and rising, but actually it's sort of going back down and up again in it. And it's an extremely, extremely clever and entertaining over this amazing drumming. So musicianship fabulous, recording fabulous, sounds great on a decent stereo system, really good. I don't know what it sounds like on a normal kitchen radio or something, but I'm not going to bother. I'm going to enjoy this. Is this an album I'm going to listen to every week? No, it's not. Is it one I'll come back to once in a while and reflect on the days when we were doing this great recordings videos? Yes, it is. It's a masterful work, and we see experienced musicians at their peak and a team around them who are capturing what they're doing in a very, very professional and unique way. I thoroughly recommend Random Access Memories from Daft Punk as my great recording for this week. There are plenty more to come. Please keep coming with your suggestions of what you think a great recording is, and let's enjoy this wonderful hobby of ours where we could, even if we tried, we could never listen to all the music of the world. So we have to make selections and enjoy what we can. Until the next time, enjoy your music.